Thank you very much for coming. So, to make sure that you're at the right place, I'm going to talk about John P. Holland, the father of the modern submarine. In his 1924 book, Frank Cable, a former employee of Holland, wrote, "It belongs to the record to say that the Irish question produced the modern submarine." Now, I'm going to explain that as we go along. About 15 years ago, an ad hoc John Philip Holland committee formed in southeastern Connecticut to create a greater awareness and appreciation of the mechanical genius, perseverance, and remarkable achievements of John P. Holland. The committee was comprised of several members of the John P. Holland division of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, also Dr. Richard K. Morris, rest in peace, who was Holland's biographer, a grandson of Holland's superintendent engineer, Charles Morris. He was a professor at Trinity College in Hartford and a resident of Deep River. And Tom McGugan was also on our committee, as well as Gary McHugh, a naval architect. The ex officio members were directors of the Patterson Museum in New Jersey and the Nautilus Museum in Groton. To date, all of the Holland memorabilia located in both museums have been indexed. Now, we also worked with a local committee in Liscannor, County Clare, where Holland was born, to develop a small Holland museum there, but we were unsuccessful. My understanding is that there is some sort of a tribute, a museum there at this time. I haven't seen it, though. And further, we did work successfully for the inclusion of the Holland 6 boat in the U.S. Postal Service's commemorative stamp that was issued for the 100th anniversary of the U.S. Navy submarine service on April 11, 2000. Now, John Holland, like many immigrants to America in the 19th century, deserved to be recognized because they came to America armed with ideals, goals, and persistence in the face of huge obstacles. Holland's career in the U.S. occurred during the height of anti-Catholic feeling, no Irish need apply programs, campaigns, anti-immigration, know nothing political faction, and the NAST anti-Irish cartoon period. He had to be what they term a thick Irishman to survive all of that. Reportedly, the Holland family originally came from Cork, Ireland. John Philip was born in February 1841 in Liscannor, County Clare, one of 4 children. He was educated in Liscannor and then in the secondary school in Ennistimon, where he was introduced to the Irish Christian Brothers. In 1853, his father, John Sr., retired and the family moved to Limerick, and his father died that same year. But John aspired to spend a life at sea and passed the necessary examinations in Limerick, but with poor eyesight, his aspirations were extinguished, or somewhat, as you will see. In 1858, at age 17, he joined the Irish Christian Brothers to become a teacher. While in the North Monastery School in Cork, he was encouraged to follow his interests in the physical sciences and math. In 1862, while in Ireland, Holland was intrigued by the U.S. Civil War battle between the ironclad vessels, the Union Monitor and the Confederate Merrimack in Hampton Roads, Virginia. This departure from wooden ships was to significantly influence Holland. And it was in 1869 that he began in earnest his quest to design underwater iron boats. He conducted his first successful underwater propulsion experiment using a clock-driven boat in a wooden tub of water. In 1872, his family emigrated to America, and his own health failed temporarily in 1873, and with no family ties left in Ireland, he declined final vows in the Irish Christian Brothers, and he emigrated to America at age 32 years. He arrived in Boston in November 1873, and while there, he slipped on some ice, broke his leg, and used his convalescence period to study underwater boat development. A year later, he accepted a teaching position in St. John's Parochial School in Patterson, New Jersey. And in 1875, he submitted his first submarine design to the U.S. Navy. It was then called a wrecking boat. The Navy rejected his proposal as impractical. Without funds to continue his design work, Holland continued to teach by day and to design submarines in the evening, often using the school blackboard. In this same year, he married, and the marriage produced 6 children. And also, in 1875, events were taking place among the Irish-American Fenian Brotherhood, which were later to advance Holland's career as a submarine inventor. Now, to relate Frank Cable's quote to submarine development and to explain where the Fenians got the funds to finance Holland's submarine development, I'm just going to very briefly describe an event that was taking place at that time. It was called the Catalpa Rescue. And in 1874, the Clan na Gael was devising a plan to free 6 Fenian prisoners from a British prison in Fremantle, Western Australia. They purchased a whaling ship in Boston, Massachusetts, named the Catalpa. They outfitted it in New Bedford, Mass., and engaged a New Bedford non-Irish whaling captain, George Anthony. The Catalpa set out in April 1875 to effect the rescue. And only the captain knew of the real purpose of the voyage. The Catalpa crew did not learn about the real purpose until they had passed some of the best whaling grounds in the Atlantic. And then the Catalpa arrived in Fremantle in March of 1876, 11 months after leaving New Bedford. After a dramatic and successful rescue, they left Australia in April. That whole rescue scene, there are books written about it. It's a story in itself, intriguing, but I'm not going to go into it. So they left Australia in April. The Catalpa returned to America with its human cargo of 6 freed prisoners and their rescuers and some whale oil. She arrived in New York in August 1876, 5 months later. Celebrations in New York, actually along the east coast of the U.S., included many fundraisers to help pay for the $30,000 cost for that venture. The funds raised from these socials were deposited in the Fenian Skirmishing Fund. But on a negative note, Captain Anthony was barred by Britain from ever leading a whaling expedition in international waters for the rest of his life, and was forced to take an inside job onshore in New Bedford. But the reason I mention that now, it was at one of those 1876 Catalpa fundraisers in New York that John Holland's brother, Michael, introduced John to prominent Clan na Gael leaders. Clan na Gael and Fenian are one and the same. The Fenians saw the potential in Holland's designs to humble the British Navy in their quest for Irish independence. Holland was an Irish nationalist, but not a member of the Clan na Gael. And this is important to me anyway, Holland had meant for his invention to be a deterrent to war, and he did not foresee the aggressive role that submarines would later play. While he was a pacifist, Holland remembered vividly those scenes from the Irish famine period in Ireland and the British government's neglect of the Irish people. So he did not dismiss the Clan na Gael's interest. But further, with the U.S. Navy rejection, there were no other funds available to develop his ideas. So now finally brings me into submarine development. In the summer of 1877, the Fenians agreed to fund the construction and testing of a 30-inch model of Holland's design, which tested successfully in Coney Island, New York. John Breslin was assigned by the Fenians to oversee the Little Professor's submarine project. Holland ended his 15-year teaching career and became a full-time inventor. Breslin recommended to the Clan that they provide $4,000 from the skirmishing fund to support the development of Holland's now called diving boat. The trial of the full-scale Holland 1 boat was conducted in the spring of 1878 in the Passaic River, New Jersey, just above the Falls Bridge in Paterson. Breslin deemed it was impressive enough to warrant further financial support. The British government had spies tailing Holland, and they continued to do so throughout his Fenian connection. Following the trials and to secure secrecy, Holland removed the engine and internal equipment from the Holland 1 boat and scuttled it in the river, scuttled the hull in the river. In 1927, it was retrieved from the mud by a group of engineering students and given to the Paterson Museum. Now that Holland 1 boat was 14 feet long, 3 feet wide, 4 feet high, rectangular in shape, carried one man with 2¼ tons, submerged to a depth of 12 feet for 1 hour, achieved speeds of up to 3½ knots, and used a Groton engine. A second boat, the Holland II, was funded by the Fenians and built in April 1881, and it was tested in New York Harbor off Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. Although constructed in secrecy, a New York Sun newspaper reporter dubbed it the Fenian Ram. This boat was more than twice as large as the Holland I, had increased capacity, demonstrated superior performance, and contained an underwater pneumatic gun. Holland made significant advances in those 3 years since the start of the Holland I. The Fenian Ram contained many of the basic elements for submarine operation that we know today. So the Holland II, or Fenian Ram, was 31 feet long, 6 to 7 feet in diameter, weighed 19 tons, cylindrical in shape, carried a 3-man crew, submerged to 60 feet for 4 hours, and had cruising speeds of up to 9 miles per hour, and also had a Groton engine. But in 1883, in the dead of night and with forged papers, Breslin stole the Ram and the prototype boat from their berths in the Morris Basin, New York Harbor. The 2 boats were towed behind a tugboat up the East River and into Long Island Sound. And at the location of the present Whitestone Bridge, the prototype boat swamped. Apparently the hatch in the conning tower was not secured. It broke loose and sunk in 110 feet of water, and we believe that it's still there. In fact, Clyde Cussler at one time, I think, tried to retrieve it, but with all the debris from the bridge, using sonar, they couldn't detect the boat down there. The Ram was towed eastward to New Haven and stored in a Fenian-associated brass foundry on the Mill River. Thus ended Holland's association with the Fenians. All in all, the Fenians provided about $60,000 for the development of the 3 Holland boats. However, after they moved the Ram to New Haven, they had no one who could operate the submarine, and so they had nothing but a unique boat in storage in Connecticut. Now, besides Holland's submarine hull designs, his other patented designs included an automatic depth control, an ingenious autopilot navigational system, a submarine escape respirator, positive reserve buoyancy, a fixed longitudinal center of gravity, rapid diving capability, and automatic compensation for displacement of torpedoes. One distinguishing characteristic of Holland boats was that they could fly underwater, while other boats at that time could only descend and ascend on a level keel. In a Holland boat, one could steer to descend or ascend at various angles and while underway. So now, in 1883, Holland was free to develop and test his ideas, prove himself, and develop a reputation as an able inventor. But he had to seek other sources of financial support. In 1885, John Holland and Lieutenant Edmund Zielinski, an ex-U.S. Army Ordnance officer, formed the Nautilus Submarine Boat Company to attract funding. The result was the abortive construction and launch of the Holland IV, or Zielinski boat, in 1886, and the company lasted only 1 year. The boat did not represent a significant technical advance, largely because of external constraints imposed on Holland, and the boat was sold for parts. Over the next 2 years, several submarine design competitors surfaced, no pun intended here, in the US and Europe, and primarily Simon Lake in the US and the French in Europe. And Holland kept fully abreast of these developments during this transitional period. In 1888, encouraged by Holland's success, the Navy opened competitive bids for an experimental submarine design, and $2 million was appropriated for this purpose. Holland won the bid, but contractual problems between the shipyard and the Navy forced the bids to be re-advertised. Competition was reopened in 1889, and Holland again won the bid. This time, a change in the nation's presidency resulted in a change in the office of the Navy Secretary, and the incoming secretary opted to use the appropriated money to complete the building of surface ships already under construction. So the period from 1888 to 1893 marked a low point in Holland's career. He worked for his friend Charles Morris as a draftsman in the Morris and Cummings Dredging Company in New York at $4 a day. But while employed in the dredging company, Holland was introduced to a lawyer, Elihu Frost. In 1893, Frost provided Holland with funding to form the Holland Torpedo Boat Company to continue development of submarine torpedo boats. In 1895, when Congress appropriated $200,000 to open competition for an experimental submarine, Holland won the bid with a design for boat number 5. This boat, the Plunger, was built in Baltimore alongside a submarine boat, the Argonaut, being built by one of Holland's competitors, Simon Lake. And there's a model of the Plunger in that back of the room. However, Holland found a Navy committee always looking over his shoulder and making changes. He claimed that naval officers wanted a deck to strut upon, even on an underwater boat. So finally, he was convinced that the unrealistic Navy requirements were rendering his boat as too cumbersome, and he concluded that it was doomed to failure, which later proved to be the case. In 1896, seeing no future in the Holland 5 boat, the Holland Torpedo Boat Company, using private funds, began construction of Holland's new design, boat number 6. This boat was constructed in New Jersey, concurrent with that of the Plunger in Baltimore. The Holland 6 was launched in May 1897, and the first successful sea trials off Perth Amboy, New Jersey, were conducted on St. Patrick's Day in 1898. The Holland 6 boat was vastly superior to the Navy's Holland 5 boat, the Plunger. And the Holland 6 boat was to become the model for U.S. Navy submarines for decades. However, by this time, Frost was principally concerned with protecting his business interests and with containing Holland within the company. Reportedly, without Holland's knowledge, Frost bought the rights to all of Holland's patents. Now, the Holland 6 was 53 feet long, had a 10-foot beam, weighed 63 tons, cylindrical in shape, had a 6-man crew, achieved speeds of 6 to 10 knots, contained a Whitehead torpedo tube and 2 pneumatic guns. It submerged to 60 feet for 40 hours and had a 45 horsepower Otto engine. During the period 1898 to 1899, the president of Electrodynamic Company and Electro Launch Company, Isaac Rice, became a large investor in the Holland Torpedo Boat Company. An 1899 company reorganization created the Electric Boat Company, with the Holland Torpedo Boat Company as a subsidiary. Management of the company showed the following: President Isaac Rice, Secretary-Treasurer Elihu Frost, General Manager John P. Holland, and Superintendent Engineer Charles Morris. In 1899, the company moved the at-sea test area away from busy New York Harbor to New Suffolk, Long Island, in the Cutchogue area in Little Peconic Bay. This site became the first submarine base in the United States, not the first U.S. Navy submarine base. And bidders worldwide, including the U.S. Navy, were invited to witness the many successful sea trials of the Holland 6. However, the U.S. Navy, which was the preferred bidder, was slow to commit itself. In 1899, Holland's health deteriorated, and he was advised to take a working vacation. He returned to the British Isles, and the trip allowed him to visit Ireland. Previously, while under contract to the Fenians, the British government barred Holland from returning to Ireland under threat of arrest. And while Holland was gone, Frost maneuvered to reduce Holland's influence within the company. A new design team and a new skipper of the boat were hired. Both areas had been Holland's responsibility. And for the longest time up to this point, Holland was the only one doing his own testing underwater of the submarines that he built. The recommendations that the U.S. Navy purchase the Holland 6 boat came from Admiral Dewey and from then Assistant Navy Secretary Theodore Roosevelt. And on April 11, 1900, The Holland 6 was purchased by the U.S. Navy for $150,000. Soon thereafter, it was assigned to the torpedo station in Newport, Rhode Island. It later became the USS Holland, or the SS-1. And with the contract in the hands of the Electric Boat Company, Frost and Rice plotted the decline of Holland's career in the company. In June, he was given a 5-year contract as chief engineer with a fixed salary of $90 a week and no royalties from patent incomes. In August of that year, a new contract for the construction of 6 more improved Holland 6 boats was inked. This improved design represented the A-boat class, and thus the submarine fleet of the U.S. Navy was born. Electric Boat sold Holland boats to Japan, Russia, Germany, and Britain. However, by this time, Holland was being ignored by the company that he founded. When Holland's 5-year contract expired in March 1904, he resigned from the Electric Boat Company. With the help of Charles Morris, he formed the J.P. Holland Submarine Boat Company. He produced a design for a faster submarine boat and submitted it to the Navy. Rice and Frost fought Holland in the courts, stating that all of his patents, even those obtained before and after leaving Electric Boat, were the property of Electric Boat. This legal stranglehold scared off most potential financial backers, including the U.S. Navy. Holland spent most of his money and time fighting Electric Boat in the courts. His company folded in 1907, and he quietly retired to community life and to his family, his wife Margaret and 5 children. And John Holland died on August 12th, 1914. His anniversary death would be tomorrow. He died in Newark, New Jersey. And he died a relatively poor man at the age of 73 years. John, his wife, and all of his children are buried in Holy Sepulchre Cemetery in Totowa, New Jersey. 40 days after his death, a German U-boat sunk several British cruisers with a loss of 1,400 sailors, and the submarine became a weapon to be reckoned with. Now, I have a brief epilogue that I'd like to present. To consider Holland's achievements, extensive post-World War II U.S. Navy research revealed that the ratios of the dimensions for hull design configuration necessary to achieve optimal performance, that is, high speeds underwater with minimal drag resistance, were almost identical to those of the Fenian Ram and the Holland 6 boats. And these design results produced the experimental diesel submarine Albacore, and in 1958, the nuclear-powered skipjack class submarine. Now, what happened to the Fenian Ram? In 1916, it was brought from New Haven to Madison Square Garden in New York City and displayed as a fundraiser for the victims of the 1916 Easter Uprising in Ireland. For some time thereafter, the Ram was displayed on the grounds of the New York State Marine School in Clawson Point, Bronx. In 1927, it was purchased and displayed in Patterson's West Side Park, New Jersey. She was later donated to the Patterson Museum. So the Holland 1 and the Fenian Ram are presently displayed in that museum. The last days of the Holland 6 are rather sad. It was always used as a training boat and was never operational as a combatant. It was assigned to the Norfolk, Virginia Navy base during the period 1900 to 1910, when it was decommissioned. In 1913, it was sold to a scrap dealer, and in 1916, it was saved from the scrap pile, sold for $350, and was displayed in the Commercial Museum in Philadelphia. And then from 1918 to 1932, it was on open-air display in West Farm Square, Starlight Park, the Bronx, New York. And in 1932, this historical vessel was ignominiously cut up and sold for scrap for $100. So it's some references now. In 1966, the Naval Institute published John Holland's biography by Dr. Richard K. Morris. In 1971, the U.S. Navy produced a video entitled "No Deck to Strut Upon," a commendable depiction of Holland's career, and that's the video we'll see when I'm finished here. In 1976, the submarine veterans raised funds to replace the headstone on Holland's grave. The original headstone, also provided by the submarine veterans, was then transported by the Navy to Holland's hometown of Liscannor in County Clare, where for years it rested on the edge of a parking lot. The University of South Carolina Press reprinted an updated version of Dr. Morris's book. In 1998, excuse me. And lastly, Gary McHugh, a member of our Holland Ad Hoc Committee, maintains a technical archive of John P. Holland and a history of submarines. And Gary can be contacted by email, and I have that information here if anybody's interested and wants to contact him, be glad to give it to you. Information on John Holland is also available on Google. I conclude by saying that John P. Holland aptly deserves the title Father of the Modern Submarine. He persevered to develop a practical underwater craft designed to change the course of naval history. The submarines of the major Navy fleets of the world, except those of France, are direct descendants of the Holland 6 boat. And in view of the Clan de Gale's early funding of Holland's formative stage of submarine development, I return to Frank Cable's 1924 quote when he wrote, "It belongs to the record to say that the Irish question produced the modern submarine." And as a capping note to Frank's quote, it is ironic that the first British submarine was named the HMS Holland. So this is the video produced by the Navy called No Deck to Strut Upon. It's a depiction of Holland's career.
Distinguished guests, it is an honor and a privilege
Good day to you.
to introduce one of the
You know,
greatest men of
if you look hard enough, you can see me at every luncheon. My name's John Philip Holland. You could say now that the story of that submarine there, and every submarine for that matter, is, in a way, my story too.
Liscannor in County Clare, a typical Irish village near the sea. John Holland was born here in this cottage in 1841. He longed to be a sailor.
But with my fuzzy eyes, no one would trust me to row a two-oared boat, much less navigate a ship.
He became a teacher instead, and that might have been the end of it. But one day he read a news story which fired his imagination. In the American Civil War, a strange-looking cheese box on a raft, the Monitor, had bested the Confederate Virginia, an ironclad, rebuilt from the damaged hull Merrimac.
It was her low freeboard that made Monitor so hard to hit. Now, why didn't they go all the way, thought I, and make her a submarine in the first place?
The idea of a submarine boat of war never left Holland in all the unsettled years that followed. But he got nowhere. And finally, he left teaching in Ireland to join his mother and brothers in America.
Fate sometimes moves in strange ways. A slip on the ice in Boston put me flat on my back with a broken leg. It was a blessing in disguise, for it gave me a chance to carefully review all I'd ever learned and thought about submarines.
A Dutchman, Cornelius van Drebbel, had made the first practical effort at submarine navigation in 1620. The Americans got into the picture during the Revolution with David Bushnell's Turtle, a remarkably complete boat, but its attempt to sink a British warship failed. Robert Fulton developed his Nautilus in 1800. Behind the craft, a bomb was towed, which he called a torpedo, after a fish that kills its prey by electrocution. But Fulton's potential customer, the French, would not buy it. The Confederates had an underwater vessel, the Hunley, propelled by 8 men and with a long weapon spar forward. They loaded explosives on the head of the spar and shoved it into the side of a Union blockade ship, Housatonic, in Charleston Harbor. It blew her apart, but Hunley went down also. It had become obvious that to fight underwater and survive, your torpedo had to be a free and self-propelled missile. In 1868, an English engineer, Robert Whitehead, developed just such a weapon, powered by compressed air. Now at last, the submarine had its teeth for battle.
That is, if one could be developed which the authorities would accept. Oh, I itch to get to work on the project.
A few months later, Holland sent his proposition to the Navy Department, and he did so with a measure of satisfaction. He knew his approach to the submarine was the right one.
The captain who answered advised me to drop the matter. To get something done in Washington, he wrote, is uphill work. Uphill work, was it? Very well, then. There were other ways.
Mr. Holland? I'm John Breslin. Sit down, please.
Thank you, Mr. Breslin.
Now then, your brother's been telling me about this boat of yours that swims underwater. You know, of course, whom I represent.
The Fenian Society. You want a free Ireland?
Right you are, John Philip Holland. And this boat of yours, if it works, can help us to get it. Now then, what can you do to convince me that it'll work?
I have a small model. I can demonstrate it for you this Sunday.
You're right to the point, Mr. Holland. And I'll tell you this, if she does work, the Fenian Society is prepared to back you in building a full-scale boat. For the greater glory of a free Ireland.
She'll work all right, Mr. Breslin.
If she does, we can use her.
She did work that Sunday, beautifully. And pretty soon we were in the submarine business.
By May 22nd, 1878, all was ready for the launching of John Holland's boat number 1. A group of mill hands heading home that afternoon gathered on the Spruce Street Bridge over the Passaic River in Paterson, New Jersey, to watch what would happen with Holland's wrecking boat. One of the onlookers remarked that the professor, as they called him, had built a coffin for himself. When the 2 1/4-ton submarine slid into the water and floated free at the end of her tow line, the people on the bridge saw what they had expected. Suddenly, something went wrong. The boat settled rapidly in the water and disappeared. Holland discovered the cause as faulty riveting, and in a month, boat number 1 was functioning so well that Breslin's group authorized the construction of a second and larger boat. And this time, the skeptics thought the professor had built his new coffin for 3 men instead of 1.
When we went down, all you could see was a dark green blur. Then there was a jar, and we knew we'd hit bottom. After a while, I blew the ballast. Slowly, as it gathered buoyancy, we rose. Until it fair to dazzled me.
The Fenian ram, they called her. Because of her shape, she could swim underwater as fast as on the surface.
And I'd left the bric-a-brac off her topside. In fact, there wasn't even the semblance of a deck. Even an iron fish has to have the clean lines of a fish.
Breslin and his bunch were so excited they put Holland to work on a third sub while the ram was still being tested. Soon, the two ships were docked side by side. But the Fenians began to think the professor's submarines were costing them too much. Under cover of one New Jersey night, the Fenians appeared with tugboat at the dock. There, a dubious night watchman let himself be convinced an order had come from Holland. In short, Breslin stole both boats.
Oh, I was mad when I found out about it. Terrible mad. The fools left the hatch open on the new boat and lost her in Long Island Sound. And as for the ram, not a man of 'em knew how to sail her. I should have known better than to trust an Irishman.
Holland then put together a concern which built a fourth and unsuccessful submarine. The sign of the company went down as quickly as it went up. But John Holland went on trying. He did so in the only way he knew. Long hours poured into design detail. He came to know the joys of the innovator well, yet always found he had to couple them with the curses of the perfectionist. He won a Navy competition, but in a change of administrations, funds were reallocated and cut off. Then a close friend of his from the Ram days, Charlie Morris, introduced him to Elihu Frost. With Frost's financial backing, the three of them formed a new company and set out to win the Navy competition all over again when it was reopened in 1893.
We didn't have too much trouble. Our only real competition was a fella from Baltimore named Simon Lake, and he lost out in the end. But he was a clever chap, and we heard plenty from him in the next few years. In fact, the sub we were building, the Plunger, was being put together side by side with Lake's model, the Argonaut, in a Baltimore shipyard. The difference was, we had the Navy contract.
Holland soon found that that meant problems. He had to put on 2 extra propellers, and the boiler the Navy wanted was a monstrosity that would roast the crew alive. Holland convinced Frost they had to build another boat on their own. The Plunger promised to be a disaster.
So, while everyone else watched the Plunger in Baltimore, up at another yard in New Jersey, we worked on the real sub we hoped to sell the Navy, the Holland 6. Not everyone at the yard, though, had my faith.
On May 17, 1897, they were all proved wrong. The launch was a success. What remained were the Navy trials.
But the stern showed when she dived.
Hadn't he ever watched a seabird? Their sterns show too when they dive.
On behalf of the board, I must point out, Mr. Holland, that at the last trial, we couldn't tell what you were doing down there. Can't you put longer flagstaffs on that ship of yours?
The board. You know what a board is, don't you? Something long and wooden and narrow.
Let's face it, John. The Navy brass would feel a lot more comfortable if you had more superstructure on that boat.
I will not give them a deck to strut upon. This is a diving vessel, not a surface ship. What will I require next? That my boat climb a tree?
Relax, John, relax. You're the authority. If you don't want it, that's that.
Authority, is it? Go down to Washington. Plenty of people there will tell you I know nothing about submarines. Nothing at all.
John Holland had a right to be disturbed. The problems had been many and time was racing on. Now, everything hinged on the last trial on the Potomac.
Fantastic. Well, what do you think of that craft, Admiral Dewey?
Think, sir. If the Spanish had had 2 of those things in Manila, I never could have held the place. That's what I think, sir.
The Navy finally purchased the Holland 6 for $150,000 in April 1900, 3 years after they'd launched her. 6 more boats were ordered. It was the beginning of the submarine force of the United States Navy. But for John Holland, it was the beginning of the end. He and Frost quarreled constantly over how the business should be run. Charlie Morris had already resigned, and Holland soon joined him. It galled Holland to think that in all the time he worked with Frost, he'd never made more than $90 a week.
Dear Sir, as my contract expires on the 31st instance, and as it is proper that I should then withdraw from my directorship, I beg to offer my resignation. The success of your company can never be as great as what I ardently desired for it. Yours very sincerely, John P. Holland. In the next few years, I tried to form my own company, but I had no head for business. I was just a cantankerous old man whom the world had passed by.
In 1914, war clouds were on the horizon again. This time, the Germans would see to it that the submarine was not idle. Holland was sick with pneumonia, but somebody had to warn the Allies. He wrote the British Admiralty.
Imagine me, an Irishman, helping the British. I was 73, and old age must really have been catching up with me.
September 22nd, 1914. 40 days after John Holland died, the German U-9 sank 3 British cruisers off the Dutch coast. 1,400 men went to their deaths. Submarines had come a long way from the Confederate Hunley. They had become a specialized battle force in every respectable navy in the world. And yet they continued to improve. With their diesel engines for surface running and battery charging, electric motors for underwater running, periscopes and accurate torpedoes, the boats were amazingly efficient engines of destruction, especially in the hands of a skillful commander. But as time went on, radar and sonar began forcing subs to dive quicker and deeper and stay under longer. What was then needed was a true submersible that would stay under permanently, not one that had to surface periodically. 1945 brought the means, but means in themselves are not enough. you need a man to put them to use. Such a man had graduated from Annapolis in 1922. His name was Hyman George Rickover, and he was a hard driver. Stubborn, single-minded, and demanding, not only of those about him, but of himself as well.
No wonder I like him.
In 1946, it was ex-submariner Captain Rickover who represented the Navy at the building of our first atomic reactor at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The progression of logic is not hard to follow. If atomic power was going to be harnessed, then by all means put harness and all into a warship. And if you're going to do that, then put it in the ship which will return the best dividends as a weapon system, the submarine. Another man not calculated to miss the logic was Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, then Chief of Naval Operations. A battery of reports and letters designed to persuade followed, eventually to involve the top decision makers of the land. With the assignment of Captain Rickover to work with the Atomic Energy Commission, the nuclear-propelled submarine Nautilus began to take shape, and with an excitement known only once before by Holland himself. Nautilus first sailed in 1955, 9 years after work began on the Oak Ridge reactor. It was more than half a century since John Holland's efforts. But now, the age of the true submarine was finally upon us. The nuclear fact of Nautilus was a revolution of the first magnitude. Now, with unlimited power, without the air requirement for combustion, many new things could be had. One of these was great underwater speed. Designers found to their amazement that the ideal shape for high speed, the length-beam-height ratio, was...
You guessed it. Like my own Holland 6.
They applied this principle when they built the Albacore, which tested the shape. Although Albacore had conventional diesel engines, a marriage was performed. Her shape and the power of Nautilus. The result of this union was called the Skipjack.
She was commissioned in April of 1959. Somehow, I felt at ease at last.
Soon, records everywhere were being broken by atomic submarines. Nautilus went under the North Pole. Skates surfaced at it. And the Triton spent 2 months taking an around-the-world cruise entirely underwater. True submersibles, all of them, and all verifying in one way or another the versatility of nuclear propulsion. But the biggest dividend of all was just around the corner. The Polaris missile has now given that strange new fish, the nuclear submarine, immense stature in the world of strategic nuclear weapons. And here again, the iron determination of one man made the difference. In 1955, Admiral William F. Rayburn was told to develop a missile that could be fired from underwater to hit a target 1,500 miles away. In July of 1960, after one of America's greatest technological achievements, the bird left its nuclear-propelled cage on target and 5 years ahead of schedule. The George Washington became the first of our current fleet of 41 Polaris submarines. The missile's range has gone from 1,500 to 2,800 miles. This means there isn't a potential enemy on the map it can't hit. And the new Poseidon missile going into these subs is even more powerful. At the same time, the Polaris Poseidon submarine is not the ultimate underwater weapon from our standpoint. Someday our subs will be capable of delivering a missile to any spot on the globe from any spot in the oceans. This is because such a sub will carry a true intercontinental ballistic missile in it. It will be the most invulnerable of systems at sea, and it will not attract fire to the homeland. Small wonder, then, that some naval authorities feel the ICBM submarine may become the most important element of all, should we ever get nuclear war thrust upon us. But the Navy's not just interested in attack submarines and missile submarines. Disasters like the loss of Thresher and Scorpion have increased the interest in deep water search vessels like the two-man Alvin, which cruises at 6,000 feet, and Aluminaut, whose aluminum hull lets it operate to depths of 15,000 feet. And there are oceanographic research vessels like the Mizar, which was able to spot the lost Scorpion with special electronic equipment she carries to detect steel objects. And when the H-bomb was lost off Spain, the cable-controlled underwater research vessel Curve managed to recover it after its position had been fixed by Alvin. NR-1 is unique among all these research vessels. It alone is nuclear-powered, and its 7-man crew can stay down indefinitely, mapping the ocean floor and conducting other important marine studies. The U.S. Navy's pioneering exploration and study of the ocean depths, from its first acceptance of John Holland's oddball boat with no deck to strut upon, to today's sophisticated missile subs and underwater research stations, has provided the point of departure for thousands of civilian scientists, engineers, and planners for a new major industry that may well be the salvation of mankind. It's something the little professor from Patterson never dreamed of when he went down in his first floating coffin.
It's true, you know. I never did. Simon Lake, he was the one. He never thought of the submarine as a weapon the way I did. He was the one who had an inkling of some of the other things it could lead to. Now, if Simon Lake and John Holland had been one man, there would have been a real genius for you. Well, even if I did think of the submarine basically as a weapon, even if I didn't realize all the applications that technology after me has brought on, they're still my boats, every one of them. Since I passed on, I've seen many a luncheon, and I intend to see many another one. Which reminds me, that's what I really came here for. So, with your kind permission, I'll be saying so long, and getting to the work at hand. The next time you're at the luncheon of a submarine, look for me. I'll be there.
Thank you very much for coming.